Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Florida's ban on social media for children and J.D. Vance's latest proposal, along with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, to eliminate tax-free corporate mergers. I'm joined by Jeff Schollenberger and Nina Power. Sarab Amari is off reporting, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Governor Ron DeSantis has returned from the campaign trail. He's up to his usual tricks of actually proposing new laws that advance conservative priorities, often in ways that challenge other conservative assumptions. He's done it again with a new law banning social media of various kinds for children under the age of 14. He's specifically targeted social media that uh, sends notifications to users and uses kind of autoplay videos, things that are seen as making special demands on a child's attention. This is once again a kind of sign of the way some on the right are moving beyond some right-wing dogmas about non-interference with technology or embrace of kind of freedom of speech, or maybe even a kind of quasi freedom of consumption more generally. Um, Obviously, I don't think this is going to have much of an effect on the retiree population of Florida, but there are some people under 14 in the state. Not everyone there is a snowbird. Jeff, Nina, what's your take on this?
Well, I was thinking about this in relation to a recent piece by Frank Furedi that we published, which was a review of Abigail Schreier's new book on therapy. And Furedi and Schreier makes this important point, which is that many of the things associated, let's say, with childhood anxiety, this discourse was happening a long time before social media. And often social media gets kind of blamed in a sort of perhaps overblown way for this idea that children are uniquely depressed or uniquely anxious. But Furedi and Schreier, by all accounts, seem to want to put this shift into a broader history of the therapeutic, and the idea, if you like, that children have been treated and young people have been treated as vulnerable rather than as people capable of dealing with hardship and indeed should confront hardship and so on. That said, I'm actually quite pro these sorts of laws about social media, not least because Florida children should be poking alligators with sticks or something rather more wholesome than watching TikTok videos. Not dangerously, but a bit dangerously, and they should be rewilded. And certainly, it's interesting if you ever ask people would they have preferred their childhood to have had social media in it. Pretty much everybody says no. I certainly wouldn't have preferred to have had social media in my childhood, and so I wonder about this types of intervention. There are broader questions about what we value, what we do with our time, how distracted we can actually be. I think we're probably the most distracted human beings have ever been in their entire existence. We're completely overloaded by 79 million things. It's almost impossible to concentrate anymore. We've created a new kind of human being, not necessarily a good one. We should any shift back towards a sort of meditative, contemplative state, and all of these modes that we tend to forget is to be welcomed. Whoever proposes it, I think.
I mean, I suppose one interesting thing about this sort of approach is that if we think about the Ron DeSantis presidential campaign, perhaps ironically here, one of the things that was identified as bringing about its demise was that it was its advisors were too online, right? They were too fixated on what would play well with kind of right-wing social media culture, and as a result, kind of lost sight of broader concerns, and of course, made these disastrous viral, or at least attempted to be viral videos involving sort of actual fascist symbolism and so on. And so I suppose what I'm getting at here is that there is a slight irony in politicians and their advisors who are not exactly
Terminally online
sort of
is the phrase, right?
who are not exactly wholesome in their relationship to social media, kind of taking this position, and that's not to say it's that's not an argument for or against it, but it is interesting, and I think it probably speaks to the limitations of any efforts of this sort. Although, like Nina, I agree. I can't see any positive argument for social media being available to young people. Like it just seems obviously bad, and undesirable. But at the same time, I think we're seeing the limitations of it just in the fact that the people pushing this are not exactly avatars of some kind of wholesome relationship to technology, and so that that kind of strikes me as interesting here, and particularly that Ron DeSantis has sort of largely made his name, other than in his his overall quite impressive record on bucking the trends of COVID policy, has largely made his name as being the avatar of sort of anti-wokeness, which is, if anything, is one of the most sort of terminally online tendencies of American politics, which is just driven by a kind of obsessive fixation on constant outrage, fed by endless viral clips. And just look at sort of Elon Musk's Twitter feed, which is just sort of this endless retweets of these accounts like End Wokeness and Libs of TikTok, which are clearly, it's clear that there's sort of a there's a general idea that there are these sort of feedback loops that are damaging, perhaps in sort of ideological ways, to young people, and are sort of that part of this anti-wokeness movement is sort of if you think of Libs of TikTok, right, this idea that there are these sort of malign influences that are reprogramming children's beliefs about, or sense of their own gender, and ideas about race, and so on and so forth. But of course, this movement is itself just completely defined by its hyper addicted relationship to this kind of content. And so I don't know, there's something I suppose what I'm getting at is that if I suppose there's a sort of do as I say, not as I do kind of issue here, where if the sort of adults in the room who are attempting to impose legislation that pushes us towards a more healthy relationship to social media are themselves actually social media addicts, that probably suggests that the effects of this are not going to be quite as resounding as one might hope. So again, I think there's a question of how much law can reshape culture, right? If culture and the kind of derangement of culture is being fed by tendencies that go a lot deeper than law, that there's sort of a question of whether law is capable of actually. I mean, there are the obvious practical questions of whether there are going to be ways around this, which I'm sure there are, but there's also just the question of to what extent a law like this can actually alter these dynamics if the broader cultural trends, including among the people who are promoting and promulgating the law, are are still pointing in the same direction. And then finally, just one other thing is we had this debate about this TikTok ban legislation, where you did really see the right kind of split on this question, where I think there are some elements of the right that were very, very hostile to the idea that this would just give the government more power to, in effect, regulate speech and communication. And so there is sort of that, I'd say that tension within the right at the moment, and that was certainly, quite pronounced in the reactions to the proposed TikTok legislation. So, it'll be interesting to see what debate this DeSantis law unleashes.
Yeah, I got it. I mean, I think that's fairly well observed about the DeSantis campaign, and it's sort of some of the kind of online tendencies of some of its junior staffers or communication staff, uh, and I think I like Nina. I think really you said kind of what my initial thoughts on this were. I'm not entirely sure that social media is causing our mental health crisis. I'm not really well positioned to evaluate those claims. Uh, I'm not sure social media is vastly worse than say television or what have you, or kind of other things we've dealt with. Um, you know, uh, there used to be other things. Even before kind of electronic communication. Urban centers, you would have mail delivery multiple times a day. People complain about always being distracted, checking their watches when kind of watches first became available. Um, so people are very good at being distracted. But like I just don't see any upside in social media. So whatever, who cares? Let's just ban it. It's fine. Just ban it for at least for children. We'll start there. We can move on. Just ban it for everyone. Okay, others. Liberty's fine. Let people make their mistakes, but I think for the children, we can get rid of it. They should probably just be playing with sticks or wooden toys at worst. Wooden toys with like natural kind of paint or whatever kind of some sort of Waldorfy thing. That really something like that is best. So let's let's try to get there. I'm all for the DeSantis ban. Um, yeah, good for him. It's I mean it's kind of funny, right? You have a right wing government in Florida pushing this, but I do think that there's rising skepticism of social media use among maybe I'm wrong about this, but my perception is, among kind of left-leaning urban professionals, really the kind of most intense base of the Democratic Party, that they don't want their kids on the phone at a young age. They don't want their kids using TikTok or whatever. So they are probably less likely, I would say that the most intense Democratic voters are less likely to let their kids use social media than maybe certain right-wing constituencies would be. That are kind of less committed to these crunchy lifestyle elements. So there's a kind of interesting aspect of this, which maybe connects to longstanding conservative observations about the kind of upper class having a not basically not failing to preach what they practice, having certain practices but not really insisting on them as a broad social ethic. um, anyway, good for Ron. He's back in the saddle, back doing DeSantis type things, uh, and seems to be all for the good here to me. Yeah, I guess just one other thing I'd add. I was in Israel last year, and spoke to a kind of jurist in a Haredi community there, and he talked about the difficulties they're having just with the rise of the internet. And he said it used to be that when you had to have a satellite dish to get television or to watch certain things, it was still possible to really regulate the private behaviors of the community. But now, you know, a lot of people just have a laptop in their closet, whatever. Like they watch Curb Your Enthusiasm or whatever. I mean, they do things they're not supposed to be doing. I'm sure, pornography, all kinds of things. And at some point, just the existence of these technologies really kind of tends to escape communal regulation. So uh, I think there are certain constraints to how restrictive we can really get. Parents will sign their kids up for social media even if they're underage. I mean, some parents, uh, kind of make money off their children's social media profiles, kind of make a career of it, um, and a lot of parents are permissive. So I don't think that uh, we're really going to be able to stop this phenomenon altogether. But why not try? Why not try? Uh, another news. Um, J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, has co-sponsored a bill with Sheldon Whitehouse that'll eliminate tax exemptions for mergers when the businesses involved have a combined annual revenue of more than $500 million. This is really kind of the latest move taken by Vance. Uh, he's also partnered with Elizabeth Warren to propose limits on executive compensation at banks, and he partnered with Sherrod Brown to promote rail safety regulations after the rail disaster in East Palestine, Ohio. Uh, just it's notable, and several outlets have reported on this because Vance has not only engaged in these bipartisan efforts, he's distinguished himself as maybe the most consistent and outspoken defender of Donald Trump in the U.S. Senate. So he's at one and the same time very populist, very MAGA, uh, very much a partisan, but has crossed the aisle on discrete issues. Something that distinguishes him from some of the other kind of outspoken MAGA types. So yeah, just I'm curious what you all make of that.
Well, I suppose one subject that comes up here is sort of the the obvious point that there's sort of a question of MAGA succession that is going to be raised sooner rather than later, right? And that the sort of cult of personality dimension of the MAGA side of things, right, where really it is about the fixation on this one kind of singular political figure. But nonetheless, he's not getting any younger, and so then there's a question of what the next version, of that political tendency is going to be. So, in one earlier version, it was going to be Ron DeSantis, right, who was supposed to be basically the figure who, enabled a kind of um, evolution of a sort of Trumpian populism into something more, politically savvy and, more focused on pushing through legislation rather than kind of getting embroiled in media flame wars and so on. So a kind of more, a more competent and capable, version of the kind of right populist agenda. Of course, that even though you can certainly point to a lot of achievements within Florida, I didn't, very notably didn't translate into a sort of national brand that propelled DeSantis to anything close to winning the nomination. And so, then there's a question of who the next figure is, and obviously Vance is in some ways positioning himself, and I think, by being on one hand a kind of Trump loyalist, and then on the other hand a kind of, I'd say kind of more innovative figure legislatively in some of these initiatives than someone like DeSantis, whose legislative agenda has been, based on these kind of anti-woke crackdowns, which I don't, which part of the problem of which is that they never really translated into a particularly meaningful national agenda. I mean, a lot of them had to do with like the state university system in Florida. So, what does that mean for national policy that would actually affect a large number of Americans? Maybe not very much. So, it seems like Vance is sort of carving out a position for himself here. I mean, I would say, there is kind of this relates to whether he's a, prime vice presidential material. I would say there is kind of one, downside to that kind of slotting of him, which is that, he's only been in the Senate since, he was elected in 2022. So he's been in the Senate for like just over a year, I believe, if my math isn't wrong here. So, if he ends up in the vice presidency next year, he's sort of positioned symbolically as a successor, but he's had very little time to actually develop a legislative record of the sort that he seems to be really initiating. And so, and he ends up in the vice presidency, which is kind of a sort of holding pen, where, generally you're sort of, just cutting ribbons and doing other stuff like that. And so, it does kind of raise a dilemma, which is that if you want there to be a sort of, MAGA 2.0 agenda with a kind of more economic populist slant to it, clearly this is sort of this is exemplary of the kind of stuff that you would want to see taken on seriously. But that in sort of practical terms, legislatively, may be in conflict with the kind of agenda of some sort of symbolic succession. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's and I think there's another version of the sort of MAGA succession, which would basically just be a kind of I'm not sure who would embody it, but would be embodied by figures who are more just focused on kind of stirring outrage and creating more media flame wars and dishing up more red meat. So yeah, I think part of what's going on here is there is sort of a question of whether there's a sort of more broad-based like economic populist agenda that can come out of this and that can kind of be slotted into some development of a continuous longer term project. But it seems like there are various tensions around that. That I suppose we'll see how they're resolved in the coming years, but that's how I would read it.
Yeah, I was just thinking earlier today about the 2007-2008 economic crisis, and what happened in the UK was that the banks were deemed too big to fail, so that they were bailed out by the government, and it was a very clear indication of a lack of the free market, if you like. So I think what's interesting about some of these proposals, and I don't pretend to sort of follow all the details, but if it's the case really that these massive corporate mergers are not in a way playing by the rules, but are in fact passing off the burden onto workers who are then footing the bill, this is not really a kind of neoliberal economic position, but really more of a sort of state, state commerce. And it's always the sort of poorer people, working people, who have to foot the bill. And this is what happened in the UK under austerity. It was really the poorest people who had to pay the most for the bailout of banks and other big corporations. And I think the time is right for a rethink of this kind of populist economics that seeks to put the market in its place, that situates the market in relation, a relation of subordination ultimately to something like the common good, and the rights and the lives of working people. So yeah, anything like this is interesting, I think, because it goes against the narrative that if you're on the left, you always understood, which was that the right was somehow always pro free market and that the market was king. So yeah, I think it's another of these sorts of shifts to a kind of more economically nuanced political position on the part of people who are Conservative or Republican, in the name of perhaps something like a New Deal or a reenchantment of Labour. And in that sense, I think is to be welcomed. Also, it's a kind of bipartisan bill, which again signifies a sort of post-political or a kind of, let's say, apolitical understanding of the destructive quality of corporate being, let's say.
Yeah, I gotta admit, I'm pretty pro JD. I think this is the kind of record he has uh, assembled already in the Senate is promising, and it's just a really welcome contrast. Not only from kind of the way certain more kind of populist MAGA influencers just kind of moan and wail on social media, but also to contrast with the more conventional GOP. Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, recently said that we'd be better off if Congress never passed another piece of legislation. So this is kind of the ultimate expression of, and it's, it's this kind of reductio ad absurdum of a certain kind of libertarian or kind of small government ideology. But yeah, the so maybe we should be glad that Johnson put the point so bluntly, because many people seem to kind of believe that they just don't want to quite come right out and say it. That really isn't Vance's position. He does think that there's a role for our democratically elected representatives in this constitutional republic to actually do things to advance the interests of the American people. I mean, you see, like with the East Palestine rail disaster, uh, Vance clearly thinks there's a role for the government to play in uh, regulating rail. That's obvious that there's going to be some kind of uh, you know regime. Someone is going to be controlling things, and why shouldn't the government have a say? Why should we always be subject to what our absent colleague calls private tyranny of various sorts? Um, and even if you're a bit on the right, or see uh, you want to see a larger role for free markets or deregulation in certain contexts. I mean, we're still going to need a government laying down ground rules. You need regulation to preserve free markets, of course. So uh, good. It's all to the good that JD is pushing forward some kind of initiatives and showing that this doesn't have to be, I think, a kind of I think this is also good and important to think about. He is not kind of building a career as a sort of what's called on the right, a Republican in name only, or someone whose economic kind of heterodoxy reflects a kind of broader drift toward the left, because such a person ultimately won't have purchase on the right or really a career on the right. So I think this kind of effort he's making it's interesting, worth watching. We'll see how well it works. I'm sure some people are probably quite dim on its prospects, but I think it's very much to be welcomed. So just one kind of last lighter item, maybe lighter, um, is this move in New York, where Jeff and I live, and Sarab does as well, to repeal adultery bans. So it is a crime in the state of New York to commit adultery. It's a misdemeanor. Um, People are rarely charged under the law, but it happens occasionally. I think last person charged under the law was a woman caught engaging in a sex act in a park. But she took a plea deal, and I think that charge was dropped. Um, so it's quite interesting. There's a report from the Associated Press, quotes from New York Assemblyman Charles Levine, a sponsor of the bill. And he says it just makes no sense whatsoever, and we've come a long way since intimate relationships between consenting adults are considered immoral. It's a joke. This law was someone's expression of moral outrage. I think the most important term there is obviously consent. Right. The notion is that as long as two adults are consenting, they can do whatever they want, and everything really hangs on that notion because if you take that term out, it's hard to see how our kind of regime of sexual regulation has liberalized in any way. I almost feel like there's a kind of law of conservation of sexual oppression or sexual regulation, and that if something is liberalized a bit in one area, it has to become more restricted at the same time in other ways. And I do think, however kind of enlightened we maybe feel now about extramarital relationships, the rise of Me Too can be read as one effort to find a way consistent with our new sexual ethic to put certain restraints on the sexual relationships of adults who have standing, who have certain responsibilities, whose sexual misdemeanors can cause real damage to people. So, yeah, I think maybe we're going to get rid of adultery laws. In certain ways, maybe that can be seen as a liberalization or kind of freeing. But I tend to think that some kind of regulation is going to come in on the back end.
I mean, obviously, adultery should be punishable by death. Plainly obvious. I was checking this because I was surprised about the New York law, and it's not just New York, it's other states as well. And I checked the English law, and we actually got rid of the possibility of prosecuting somebody for adultery in 1970. So we've been like libertine and wrong for longer. And I think it's partly to do with this rise of no-fault divorce, obviously, the idea that no one is to blame. But I think, I do think, in all seriousness, that if one gets married or if one has a child, like, these are serious commitments, and they shouldn't be treated as choices in the same way. There's something more akin to covenants rather than contracts, and I think we've kind of forgotten this idea. And it's marriage rates are quite low in the so-called developed West. But I think the people who are getting married are tending to stay married. It may be that they're getting married later. It may be that they've thought more about what that means. But in some situations where people get divorced, where they have children, it does seem to be, given how punishing divorce is, clearly is, how distressing it is for children. One wonders if there should not be more effort made to perpetuate relationships, even if they are in difficulty. And this requires perhaps a different understanding of commitment and fidelity and all of those kinds of things. And I do think there's something rather irresponsible about the liberal media, which is sort of constantly pushing these stories of affairs, breaking up marriages, polyamory, as if these things are just merely casual accoutrements to some kind of upper middle class lifestyle, when clearly they do have devastating effects on children, for example. So yeah, there's a sort of missing gap of perhaps social judgment. Bring back shame, bring back stigma, bring back the idea that if you marry someone, you have to marry them for life. In all but the most extreme circumstances, and so on. I don't think it's possible to bring these things back, but it's curious that this law is still on the book. But yeah,
so bring back shame, bring back stigma, Nina. That sounds really punishing. But I have a kind of just quick proposal for you guys. Is it possible that the sex recession, which so many people have talked about, the kind of decline in sex that people are having, that one of its causes is the decline of stigma and shame?
Yes.
Because I'm concerned that when things cease to be felt as transgressions, that they also lose their savor.
I think this is.
I think more seriously, a lot of it has to do with people aren't getting married, and married. When you're married to someone, you'll tend to have a lot more sex than when you aren't. But on the other hand, too, isn't a lot of the kind of the sort of dark pleasure, the kind of savor of fornication, of adultery, of all of these things that used to have a certain kind of frisson, isn't that just sort of dissipating, and as we become more liberal and open-minded and progressive on all these things, just the joy is leaving life, because, as Augustine says, the presence of the prohibition increases the pleasure of the transgression. So
yes, I believe Mary Harrington, amongst others, has proposed a kind of rewilding of sex, which is to say a kind of critique of contraception and the idea that actually sex should be understood in context as something risky and something dangerous. I think this kind of fake transgression that people are being sold, one might see the Zoomers or this supposed sex recession in a positive light, which is to say that younger people are taking sex much more seriously and perhaps abstaining with the idea that there is something actually quite meaningful about it. And that's one way of understanding it, I think, rather than the kind of hedonism of the 90s and 2000s, which perhaps, well, certainly my generation grew up with, which was the idea, I suppose, that sex was first and foremost for pleasure. It didn't really have any greater meaning than that, and so perhaps we're in a kind of post-sexual revolution, 60 years after, point at which there is a reevaluation of the moral dimensions of sex and sexuality.
I was just going to point out that divorces has actually declined quite a bit. So, I mean, but I think the reason divorce has declined is that people aren't getting married, or the bar for getting married is higher. So, in other words, fewer people are getting married. When they do, they're less likely to get divorced. Anyway, I mean, so I guess it would have to be, if the desirable thing here is sort of family formation in some kind of common good sense, then it seems like perhaps the problem is more trying to create conditions under which people form families than trying to create conditions under which people don't get divorced, because the divorce rate is actually relatively low at the moment by historic standards, but the family formation rate is what's so I guess my larger point here might be that this adultery, the having adultery be illegal. I mean, I agree with the point that it's not as if there isn't stigma attached to these things. It's just the way that it expresses itself has sort of shifted. I was there was this expose of this neuroscientist and sort of pop science figure named Andrew Huberman, I believe, in New York Magazine the other day, and interestingly, part of it had to do. It's kind of a like belated Me Too type story, but there's like one anecdote from it in which he's on a camping trip with this woman he's attempting to conceive a child with, and so she's like injecting IVF nightly while they're on this camping trip, but then she discovers that he's like meanwhile texting with this other woman he's also involved with the whole time, and talking about how their relationship is important too. So I mean, the point is, like, clearly what's going on here is that there is a concern about this kind of infidelity, and what I believe Freddie DeBoer in his Substack pointed out about this story was that 5 years ago, that during the sort of height of Me Too, this probably would have been career ending, or quite devastating for this guy Huberman, but it seems like that moment has peaked, and sort of it's not quite clear what the consequences, if any, will be now. But yeah, I agree completely that that there's all this kind of discomfort around these things that seems to be working itself out in different ways, and so at one point, I'm not sure when this adultery law dates to, but at one point that was a way of expressing this. I think now it's sort of it expresses itself in more incoherent ways through kind of moral panics and kind of barely articulate kind of freakouts. I'm also remembering, like, if there was any moment that seemed like a tipping point of Me Too. I believe it was this comedian Aziz Ansari, where there was like an expose by a woman who had gone on a date with him or something, and it was like there was nothing he had really done wrong, and it was kind of clear to everybody, but he was just like slightly weird and awkward.
He brought
basically
her
like in the
Jeff,
course of this date.
But you overlook the fact that he brought her the wrong kind of wine, and this is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah. That's
male
right.
behavior.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it was like one of these weird, but it seemed to be a tipping point where like a lot of people could see that this was absurd, that we were supposed to treat this as, you know, a reason to sort of, you know, turn this guy into a pariah. But it sort of revealed that nobody had quite articulated like what the concerns were here in the first place. But I mean, so this kind of going back to the sex recession and other issues that have been raised and the lack of family formation is like, I think part of it is because regardless of like the role of the frisson of transgression and, you know, bringing about sort of eroticism and so on, like a lot of this, you know, might be also just that all of these things are so fraught and so impossible to articulate any coherent rationale around, that, you know, it sort of makes sense on one level that people are simply opting out altogether, right? So there's less marriage, less divorce, and just more retreat into, you know, a kind of enemy that, you know, just reflects a kind of lack of any kind of shared sort of cultural norms or sensibilities that
so
anybody
kind of
can really articulate.
decreasing legibility or just kind of ease of following the script. So when the rules are that complicated and opaque, just no, I think there's a lot to that. Well, with that, thanks to Jeff, thanks to Nina. I also want to thank, and this is really important, our producer, Stephen Adebato, who's recently taken the reins here. Stephen is doing a great job for us producing the podcast. You can also read his work at compactmag.com and at his Substack, Cracks in Post-Modernity. And further, as you may have noticed, we have new intro and outro music composed by Marcus Lancaster, wonderful musician. And Marcus, thanks for doing this for us.